Welcome to the private life of Peg Lynch. I'm James Lilacs, and I'm here with
Astrid King, and I am Peg Lynch's daughter.
Oh, but you're so much more than that.
I am. I hope so. I am portraying my mother in these podcasts. Hopefully doing an okay job, having listened to her for, I don't want to give away how many years, but I should know her by now.
I'm sure she would have had a few critical notes of things that you got wrong.
Totally, yes.
But here's the thing. You might be asking, who is Peg Lynch and why should I care? Unjustly forgotten star of radio and television who wrote her own shows, owned her own shows, one-woman force that we're telling you about because you got to know, and once you know, you got to love her. So in this episode, she's left the small town. She's gotten a little bit of radio under her belt. She's going to the University of Minnesota, where, of course, she's pursuing her degree in radio, right?
Well, there wasn't such a thing then. They didn't, it was early days of radio. They didn't have courses on it. Drama, English. But the only way to get experience was to get it firsthand at a radio station. So she set out to do just that. Which
she will do. And it's just the start, mind you, because eventually this road she's on takes her to New York, to the top of radio, to the top of television. And her fans are going to number by the time she's done hundreds of thousands. Because she was good and she was funny. And some of these who were the fans? George Burns, Gracie Allen, Jack Benny, Phil Silvers, Orson Welles, Tyrone Powers, Marlena Dietrich, the Lula Bankhead. Even JFK was a fan in his own way. But we're going to find out about that later. Point is, you're never really a hero in your own home, are you? As we'll find out in the private life of Peg Lynch.
I think the people's families, they mean well, but they say things that nobody else will say. You're all dressed, you're going someplace that's important, and you're halfway out the door and you're already late, and they say, "Oh, is that what you're wearing?" No time to change, and you don't know what the hell to change, or you've already spent an hour discarding things.
And now you find out that color makes you look sallow, or the neckline doesn't do a thing for you, or God almighty. Your evening's ruined, confidence shot to hell. I left the University of Minnesota in 1937 wearing, under my graduation gown, a darling dress, I thought, that, according to my mother, made my arms look like 2 chicken drumsticks, which is, of course, all I could think about the entire day. Well, that and having graduated only 1 point short of making Phi Beta Kappa because I flunked cooking, of all things, which I am sure had a lot to do with my having thrown up something putrid called Spanish rice with tomato sauce all over the cookery teacher's front. I never told Mother. Well, despite my college diploma, I had to go back to being a desk girl, a receptionist at the Mayo Clinic, because I needed a job. I hated it. Going home in tears almost every night. Well, it was just so terrible to hear patients say, I'm going to visit my daughter in New Mexico next week. And you knew damn well they were going to be dead before then because you'd just seen their tests. Or the lovely young couple, just married. They were driving through Rochester saying, "Oh, home of the Mayo Clinic, let's go through for the fun of it," meaning get a checkup. And it turned out she's got an inoperable brain tumor. I had just sort of had it with medicine. What with mother and nurse there. And in Rochester, medicine was all anybody talked about. Being sick was the profession. But the worst of it was, and this is the God's truth, I would come down with every symptom of every disease or medical condition that passed over my desk. I did. All writers are hypochondriacs. Well, we think so much, I lasted 6 months at the clinic. That's it. And finally went up to Dr. Charlie Mayo. He'd kind of looked after Mother and me, taken us under his wing, ever since my dad died when I was 2. And I said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Charlie, but I think it may be time for me to quit. I'm afraid I have every symptom of prostate cancer." And he said, not unkindly, that perhaps it was time for me to move on. "But listen to me, Peggotty," is what he called me. "Doors are going to open for you," he said. "Just make sure you walk through them." And I like to think I have. And well, it was only a few days later that I got a call from Art Peterson down in Chicago. Now, Art Peterson, I didn't know him all that well, but he'd been a year ahead of us at college, and he'd gone down to Chicago and gotten a job on radio playing Dr. Rutledge on Guiding Light, it was a soap, and he was acting on some other show and doing commercials, and he had made $1,000 in 1 week. Well, I tell you, in 5 months working behind the front desk at the Mayo Clinic, I'd only made $360. When I got home that night, I told Mother about Art. I remember she had a friend over for dinner.
And Mother's lips just pursed in a straight line, and the other woman was smiling rather sweetly. And then she left, and my mother, one of the few times I've seen my mother very angry. And she said, "Don't you ever say anything like that in front of my friends again. Don't you ever tell a lie like that." I said, "It's true. He made $1,000 a week." Well, just don't even say that. And then when Mother said, "Don't say it," you don't say it. You know, there was no argument with my mother. She really didn't believe me at all. And she never thought there was anything. The only real argument I had was the fact that I did not take up educational credits when I went to college. What was I going to do with acting and writing, neither of which promised anything?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, it had in fact crossed my mind that she might have a point here. I didn't have much confidence in writing. Also, well, I was a bit confused, since my acting teacher thought I'd better continue writing, and my writing teacher thought I'd better continue acting. In fact, my acting teacher said I had such a terrible voice, such a high nasal twang, that I might as well give up any thoughts of acting. He washed his hands of me. I don't think I was ever cast in anything at college. Oh, yes, once. Alibaba.
And finally the teacher felt sorry, made me one of the 40 thieves. And then I didn't get a chance to get on because the rest of them were men. And when they rushed through the cave entrance from the back, the flat went down and I was left behind holding up the strut. I had quite a career.
Anyhow, I got a call from Art right after I'd quit the clinic. "I think there's a chance down here in Chicago," he said, "writing for radio. Can you get down here right away?" When I thought, wasn't this wonderful? Why, things were falling into my lap right away. Mother saw me off on the train, as well as about 10 of my friends, all thinking, wow, Chicago. Peg was really headed for the big time, all right. Practically got up a brass band as they all waved me off. Art met my train, got me over to the house where they all were, his wife and lots of actors staying there. But nothing was said all evening. Welcomed me, and here you are, and dinner and so forth, but no mention of the job. There wasn't even a place to sleep. I slept on the living room couch, and what I mostly remember is that they had lost several turtles.
These little dime store turtles that came with groceries if you bought so much. And I woke up in the middle of the night and this turtle was crawling up my arm. And when I flicked on I'm terrified of spiders. And so when I grabbed hold of it, it was a spider, as far as I was concerned, the size of a baseball. And I let out a shriek and woke everybody in the house. I know that. Oh, God, I've forgotten all that. I'm scared all over again.
Well, the next day, still not a damn thing was said. Finally, I got hold of Art and I said, you mentioned a possible job for me, writing for radio?
Oh, yes. And I'd forgotten how he talked very like a minister, sort of very. So he's going to get a funeral, really. And I said, and you wanted me to come down? You suggest? Yes. He said, it's a rather a good idea. I can't remember exactly what the idea was, but it's a man with, maybe you better meet him. Maybe I'd better meet him is what I was down there for. So he said, I'll give him a call tomorrow.
But he didn't. He went off to rehearsal. Finally, his wife took over and called this man, and we met at a drugstore for a cup of coffee. I've got a really good idea, the man said. And Art thought of you because you have so much to do with the Mayo Clinic, desk girl, you know, and, well, it wasn't a job offer, as it turned out, just this idea he had for a 15-minute radio show 5 days a week. I asked what the idea was. Well, we'll present a disease, he said, and then we present the solution, the cure.
I said, to do what? Give me an example. Well, he said, you pick something that a lot of people have, such as TB. I said, but what's the solution? And well, here you take diabetes, and you present insulin. I said, but that's not a cure. And he didn't have a thing. That was it. I said, 5 days a week, you're going to take 5 diseases, like cancer? And he didn't pick anything little like, prickly heat, nothing simple. Oh, and I just couldn't believe this stupid man. I said, forget it, goodbye, and went home. And go home with my tail between my legs, and I was so embarrassed, and I had to call Mother, and I said, well, there's nothing to it. I was so mad at Art, but because we could ill afford for, Mother had to take her train thing out of savings and had to borrow money. I felt awful.
I didn't let on to any of my friends. I said the Chicago job looked very promising, but that I couldn't stay and develop it, sadly, since I'd already made another commitment, which in fact I had. And although I didn't know it then, this time there was a door opening, a real one. The boyfriend of one of the desk girls at the clinic had told me that station KATE down in Albert Lea, it's about 40 miles southwest of Rochester, was looking for a girl to write commercials. I applied and was hired.
And I started that day, and I really wanted to look nice, and it was wintertime. It was the 1st of February, probably 30 below. I went in stockings and high-heeled shoes, snow up to your waist, but I didn't want to ruin my feet with overshoes. Went over on the bus and had a thin cotton dress, short sleeve. I don't know why I didn't freeze to death. You know how I am. I'm terrified of being cold.
And when I walked in, the bookkeeper girl was sitting there at her desk, and she said, do you have your show written for tomorrow? I said, what show? And she said, well, you go on the air every morning with a woman's show for half an hour. Oh, no, I'm here to write copy, I told her. I'm not going on the air. And she said, well, you are, and you've got to change your name. It can't be Peg Lynch because we just lost a girl. That's why the job is open. And she had the woman's show, and her name was Peggy. What do you want to be called? I need to know right now.
So I picked Lynn because I figured that would remind me of Peg Lynch, you see. And then I picked the family name of Fairbanks on my father's side. So I picked Lynn Fairbanks.
I was frantic. Nothing had been said to me about doing a show. I'd been hired to find sponsors and write spots. I couldn't go see the manager, the owner of the station. He was out of town, which is typical. In those days, all these small stations that were sprouting up all over the country, they were mostly owned by people whose only connection to radio was that they had just purchased a set,
And they didn't know anything about it. But what they got in their noodle, first crack, was that they could always go to Washington and confer with the FCC. It sounded terribly impressive, the Junior Chamber of Commerce meetings. So she said, you've got to do it. And if I was told I had to do something, I thought, well, I better do it. So I didn't sleep all night. I didn't type. So I got up early in the morning and started typing with this thing. And I don't know what I wrote. I haven't the slightest idea. And I was nervous.
I was terrified about going on the air, speaking with my high nasal twang. Never forgot those words. So what I did the next morning, I tried to pitch my voice low. And by the time the half hour was over, I was so dizzy from lack of oxygen. I was practically in a state of collapse by the whole thing. Hello, darling, I wrote home to Mother. I suppose you're mad I didn't send any laundry home yet, but I haven't gotten around to anything but work. I'm getting $70 a month, but my gosh, it costs almost $1.50 a day to eat. I pay $3 a week for my room, and I share the bathroom with the sister of the landlady, a nun. I got back last night to find her in a silk dress, drinking and smoking. Apparently she's defecting. Well, I get up at 4 a.m., and I walk down here to open up the station, and I do most of my writing then. I've got my half-hour woman's show, Vanity Fair, it's called, at 9:30 every morning. And then at 10, I go around town and I see all my sponsors so I can get their copy.
Buy new Rem. REM, guaranteed to cure everything from acne, stomach ulcers, eczema, impetigo, colitis, pyorrhea, dandruff, sunburns, poison ivy, athlete's foot, varicose veins, kidney, and gallbladder infections. REM, the Mayo Clinic in a box, can be yours for $1.
I have to do about 250 spots every week. They've also got me doing a weekly half-hour theater show, a weekly farm news program, 3 10-minute plays, and 2 5-minute sketches per week, and a half-hour play on Sundays. I have to work nights, so I don't get to bed before midnight. Forgive me for rushing, Mother. I still have 2 more plays to write. I'm doing about 3 a day, and it rather saps your ingenuity. Love, Peggyville, also known as Lynn Fairbanks.
Good morning, everyone. You're listening to Vanity Fair, and this is Lynn Fairbanks. And don't forget that the Alice Chalmers Farm Machinery Company urges you to drop in during their weekend sale. Ladies, take it from me. No one makes better tractors than Alice Chalmers. Your husband will love them. Alice Chalmers, if you want the best tractors for your husband. The sponsor told me what to write. Besides being utter nonsense, it was so boring. And finally I said, look, I've been saying the same thing for 15 Sundays. If the tractor's that good, and you've got me raving about it all the time, besides which, how in hell would I know how good the insides of a tractor is? But if it's so great, how come the husband doesn't ever buy the damn thing? He just keeps being told about them. He never buys one. Is he stupid? Well, I could see that my boss back from Washington, Edgar Hayek, was annoyed that I talked to the sponsor that way, but it was just so idiotic. I said, look, I'll write to Mr. Alice Chalmers himself, and oh, no, they didn't want that, no. Finally, it was agreed that in the next ad, the tractor could be bought. And I created a husband and wife sketch with which to do just that. And I called them Ethel and Albert. Well, I got the name Albert very quickly, from Albert Lee, I suppose, where I was. Ethel, I'm not sure where I picked that up. It's not my favorite name. Well, I never planned on using either of them, for the next 70 years, or that they would become well known, or that I would. Somebody asked me, it wasn't that long ago, it was an interview. They asked me if I'd ever felt really famous. Only once, I said, when I received a fan letter that was simply addressed to Peg Lynch, New York City.
Which, if I may interject, is quite an accomplishment for somebody whose first press clipping in the local paper, which would be the Tribune of Albert Lee, population 25,000, quote, Ethel and Albert is to replace the 10-minute Alice Chalmers Farm Machinery Show, which features always faithful threshing machines and manure spreaders, end quote.
Well, on the following Sunday, I got to the station early, as usual, quickly wrote my Ethel and Albert script, my first one. It was about 3 minutes long, I guess, and
I was running from my office that I'd set up in the ladies' room, since I didn't have one, and I was running from that to the studio. It was a good 50 feet, and I was due on, and I was running in. I told him, the announcer, that he was going to place, can you act? I remember running in and saying, can you act? He said, sure, who can't? You know it? So I had never done anything either, because I found out. But I said, you're playing the husband. I've written a husband and wife thing, and I don't think we rehearsed it even. I think we just read it. There wasn't time.
George Russell was his name, the station announcer.
They thought they'd gotten quite a prize when they got George. He was tall, had black hair with white wings here, and all the girls were terribly impressed. He wasn't particularly good as an actor, but he had a beautiful voice. And he had come from New York, Philadelphia, actually, and worked at some of the big stations, and a lot of places he said he'd worked. He had not worked, I know perfectly well. And he did to KAT exactly what he did to every station, and that was to go and buy. He had beautiful clothes, and what he did, and every town he'd get to, no wonder he went places, because he left them owing a stack of bills. He never paid for anything, and then he'd leave town and get another job somewhere. You see, that's why I had a lot of clothes. That's what he did at Albert Lee.
After he was fired, George, with his lovely new wardrobe, wrote me from Chicago to say that he was lining up a great job for me there at station WIND for $25 a week. And I thought, well, that's more than I'm getting here. I'd been working my tail off at KATE, and in 5 months had made a total of $258. My show was popular. I'd even been chased down the street one day and asked for my autograph, my first. So I asked my boss, Mr. Hayek, for a raise. He said no. So I followed George Russell to Chicago. Funnily enough, I guess it was about 12 years later, Mr. Hayek looked me up over at ABC in New York. He took me out to dinner, and he asked me why I'd quit.
How'd I let you go? And I said, you didn't let me go. I said, I asked you for a $5 a month raise, and you refused me. And I gave you a month's notice. He said, the person who's now doing 1/10 the work you did is getting $250 a week.
Well, despite George Russell's assurances, there was not a job for me lined up in Chicago. And well, I remember the next few months really as being the worst time in my life up till then. I mean, suddenly realizing all the competition from those far more talented than I. I'd go to these stations, I'd audition my show. They were polite, but I sensed the brush off. Of course, I wrote to Mother telling her not to worry, that Chicago was just grand, that so much was happening for me. I was busy as hell writing scripts and so on. I wonder how much of it she swallowed. Well, finally, WGN said, okay, tell you what, record a transcription disc of your show. We'll send it off to New York to head office and await the verdict. It was a great offer, too, if it panned out. It was worth $200 a week, $500 if it got commercial sponsors. I see from my letters home that George wanted 30% of whatever I'd make, cripes. Anyhow, he and I recorded a disc of an Ethel and Albert sketch. It was sent off to New York, and we crossed our fingers and waited and waited and waited about 2 months. Nothing. No word. George went on off to Gary, Indiana, saying we should try our luck there. I followed. Gary was a dreadful town. Dirty, scary. I got a job at a department store, which lasted a week because I either shortchanged everyone or overcharged them. Math clearly not my strong point even then. But of course I wrote Mother all was marvelous about the big money I'd be having soon, along with a request for $10 in the meantime, if she could spare it. Well, with still no word from New York about the transcription disc of my show, I went back to Chicago to wait there, renting a room in one of the big old McCormick houses, they were called, this one with a string of machine gun bullets across its front. I seemed to be the only one in the entire place. I was terrified. I used to push the bureau against my door at night. And I'll never know what possessed me. Just shows how green I was, I guess. But I'd come across a business card I'd been given years before. I was about 10 or 11, and Mother had taken me over to Rice Lake in Wisconsin to visit relatives. And there was a distant cousin there, great uncle or something, little tiny man. I wish I could remember his real name. But the Indians called him Little Pine, and he said I could call him that too. Very sweet, very nice man. And at one point he said, I want to go for a ride. He had a little business to attend to. He said it wouldn't take long, but we could get an ice cream on the way back. I said, oh, yes. So we got in his car and we drove a while over to Coudray, the town village was called, and we pulled up at this, I don't know how to describe it, compound, I guess, big high walls with gates, which opened for us, and we drove up to this enormous house on a lake next to the Indian reservation. I remember we went in. I was offered lemonade, which I accepted. A door opened, and lots of men came into the living room. I imagine rather taken aback to see a scrawny little girl sitting on a couch, swinging her legs. Little Pine introduced me. All the men were lovely, couldn't have been nicer. I had more lemonade, cake. Call me Al, one of them said, and I chatted to him about school and books, how I wanted to get on radio. My recollection is that he was terribly polite and interested in what I had to say, which he couldn't possibly have been. But anyway, we eventually got back to Mother and the ice cream and the cousins at Rice Lake, and before he left, Little Pine handed me his card and said, now, when you grow up, Margaret, if you ever come to Chicago, you give me a call and I'll take you to dinner. So I called him. What was it? 10 years later. Had to remind him who I was. Rice Lake, Little Pine. I said, Margaret Lynch. Oh, yes. Anyhow, the car, a limousine, picked me up, and we went out to dinner. Lovely, very fancy. He was charming as ever, and afterwards asked if I'd like to take a little drive down to Cicero. I said, sure. We pulled up in front of what appeared to be a nightclub. We'll go in the back way, he said. I said, fine. And we got in there, and I was introduced to a lot of men, all perfectly lovely and polite. A couple of faces looked vaguely familiar, and I said to one, didn't I meet you about 10 years ago over at Coudray in Wisconsin? Which appeared to stop him in his tracks. You said, call me Al? I said, the man said, Coudray. Oh, that could have been my brother, he said. I'm Ralph. I made no connection whatsoever with the Capones. Christ almighty. Well, it was a delightful evening in Cicero, all very above board. And after about an hour, the limousine took me home. I still can't recall Little Pine's real name, but...
Well, I tell you, when I picked up a book about 5 years later, it was called Rattling the Cup on Chicago Crime by somebody named Sullivan. And I find that I don't think Willie Moretti was his name, but the man that I met had 53 murders to his credit. I tell you.
Furthermore, most accounts I've since read of the St. Valentine's Day massacre state that Capone and his lieutenants plotted the massacre at the Coudray house. To think I'd been happily hobnobbing with them all, not once but twice. Gripe, sitting there swinging my little legs on the couch, sipping lemonade and chatting to Al about my radio dreams while he's trying to work out the biggest gang killing of the whole era.
Gives you a turn, really. I said if I'd been attractive, nobody'd have seen me again. Thank heavens. That's the only time I've appreciated not being. I'd forgotten that. It was funny.
No, I don't think of myself as attractive. Never have. Undoubtedly helped by something my aunt said to me when I was about 8 or 9. Aunt Helen, honey, loved her. God knows, sweet woman, fun. I can't recall the exact circumstances, and I'm sure she thought she was being kind, but her words have stayed with me all my life. It doesn't matter that you're not pretty, Helen said. You have a nice personality, so don't worry about it when you grow up. You'll do fine. Family. You know, cripes. Well, I guess she was right. I've done fine. But I often wonder how much further I'd have gotten in this business had I been pretty. Well, that's enough of that. And that was enough Chicago for me in 1938. I tried for jobs at radio stations in the Twin Cities. No luck. I wonder now, though, how hard I really tried. I was so discouraged, confidence shot in so many ways. And I seem to recall I'd get to the stations, but then be so terrified I'd escape before I even got to the receptionist. Well, George Russell had left Gary, owing rent, then Chicago, owing everybody in sight, and was now working at station WCHV down in Charlottesville, Virginia. He said there was a job for me down there as well, which I doubted, but went, having nowhere else to go. And I brought my Vanity Fair show featuring Ethel and Albert along with me. But this time there was a job. Another real door had opened. On the way down there to Virginia, on the train, I explained to the 2 girls sitting next to me that I was actually in spy work, counter-espionage in America, that radio and writing were just my cover. A writer's imagination.
I wasn't aware that Peg worked for WCIA, but I learn something every day. Astrid, what's coming up next?
Well, Peg heads south to radio stations to discover Southern hospitality, or not, depending on the case. She discovers how green she was as a small-town girl from Minnesota, and makes her way to the Big Apple.
That's next on The Private Life of Peg Lynch. The Private Life of Peg Lynch was written by Astrid King and produced by Alex King.